The prevailing narrative in some circles suggests that colonization in Africa might have had its benefits. Many believe that despite the dark shadow it casts, European colonization played a pivotal role in steering the continent away from perceived backwardness and savagery, leading it toward modernity. This idea of a civilizing mission by the West has become deeply rooted in historical discourse. Intriguingly, debates even emerge among Africans regarding which colonial power, be it British or French, left a more positive legacy. But is this viewpoint universally accepted? And what implications does such a perspective hold for our understanding of Africa's rich and diverse history? Let's delve deeper to challenge and decode these perceptions. A closer look at history, authentic history, reveals a significant oversight in the Western narrative on colonization. Interestingly, with the exception of Oceania, Europe was one of the last continents to witness the emergence of a major civilization. If any group is to be acknowledged as the true civilizers of the world, it would be the peoples of Africa. Scientific advances and innovations can be traced back to regions such as Southern Africa and the Great Lakes, marking some of humanity's earliest advancements. The ancient Egyptian civilization, recognized for its monumental achievements, began its remarkable journey anywhere from 7,000 to 17,000 years ago. The foundational knowledge of many of Greece's illustrious scholars, like Pythagoras, Thales, Archimedes, and Plato, originated from Africa. They journeyed to the continent for their education, where they delved into the profound philosophical theorems and concepts of ancient Egypt. Many of these teachings and discoveries are mistakenly credited to them today, overlooking their true African origins. Europe cannot claim the sole mantle of civilizing the world, especially considering its own later entry into the annals of civilization. While Africa was crafting architectural marvels like the pyramids and exploring distant lands, European ancestors were engaged in more rudimentary forms of existence. The devastating impact of the European slave trade on Africa's rich history cannot be overstated. Similar to the destructive actions of extremist groups, European slavers, often sanctioned by religious institutions, decimated African civilizations they encountered and committed widespread massacres to capture slaves for burgeoning European markets, particularly sugar and coffee production, all under the banner of religious justification. Africa's decline was precipitated by the arrival of Europeans with advanced weaponry, an undeniable historical truth. The combined terror of the European and Arab slave trades lasted 350 years and resulted in the loss of an estimated 400 to 600 million African lives, which is roughly 66 to 75% of the population at the time. This tragedy ranks among the gravest crimes against humanity in history. Colonialists were driven by a desire for wealth, similar to those involved in the slave trade, along with a need to assert racial and cultural dominance. Following the harrowing era of the slave trade, a devastated Africa faced European conquest. Slavery persisted in many parts of Africa until the 1940s, primarily through forced labor. In Angola, the situation was particularly grim. Portuguese overlords often neglected to feed their enslaved laborers, leading to deaths from exhaustion and starvation within weeks. New replacements were swiftly brought in. During the period of colonial occupation, millions of African individuals, including men, women, and children, endured the brutality of forced labor. They were subjected to physical punishment, starvation, and even the kidnapping and starving of their families to coerce them into work. The mortality rate in these conditions was staggering. Any attempts at rebellion were met with severe repercussions, including the torching of villages and execution of rebels. The primary goal of this exploitation was to harness Africa's vast resources, from minerals to crops, and build the necessary infrastructure to export these riches to Europe. Local populations faced extortionate taxes, often paid in the form of their own agricultural produce, livestock, or land. Failure to comply led to violent consequences, including village burnings and mass executions. With food scarcity and the resultant weakened immune systems, epidemics became widespread, leading to catastrophic loss of life. The renowned French historian and geographer, Louise-Marie Diopmez, who delved deeply into the impacts of both slave trades and colonization in her book, Afrique Noire, Soul, Démographie et Histoire, sheds light on slavery in DR Congo. Pardon me for butchering the language of the last remaining neo-colonialist front in Black Africa. She describes that when local inhabitants were ordered to increase their harvests, many began to resist by either refusing, fleeing, or hiding in nearby bushes and caves. The resistance was met with extreme measures, including the use of grenades to extract those hiding. To amplify production, residents were forced into night labor. With their spirits crushed, fatigue setting in, and in a dazed state, they ceased planting altogether. This resulted in famine, outbreaks of diseases, including symptoms akin to those seen in concentration camps, and an escalation in mortality. Hunger grew so acute that there were instances where the deceased were exhumed for consumption. In dire circumstances, those less affected by illness would resort to consuming the severely ill. Africa's rich natural resources became the possessions of Western nations. The continent's oil, diamonds, bauxite, uranium, iron, timber, cocoa, and more were claimed by Western multinational corporations, further enriching Europe, a continent that had previously amassed immense wealth from the slave trade. Did Africans reap benefits from the exploitation of their homeland's resources? The answer is a resounding no. From the code of the indigenous in French colonies to areas off-limits to blacks in British territories, and the apartheid policies set by Dutch settlers in South Africa, Africans were marginalized in their own homeland. They were treated as inferior beings, denied the right to vote, stripped of their lands and assets, and kept out of their nation's governance unless they were fervent collaborators. This was especially evident in the French colonies where some were termed as evolved. During the colonial era, the white colonizer was often perceived, and acted, as if he was superior or even divine in Africa. Colonization didn't just take our land and resources, it sought to erase our identity. It demeaned African cultures and religions, downgrading our rich languages to mere dialects. Christianity was imposed upon us, with the figure of a white Jesus, subtly implanting the idea of white divinity and supremacy in African minds. The rich tapestry of African history was either distorted or erased altogether. When even our ancestral lineage is taken away, what foundation do we stand on? Colonial powers executed a systematic brainwashing, making Africans feel their traditions were lesser, even demonic. This conditioning made many believe that to progress and modernize, they had to abandon their roots. Yes, the colonizers brought us languages like English, French, and Portuguese, touting them as superior mediums of knowledge. But they seldom acknowledged that ancient Greeks were imparted knowledge and religious tenets in languages akin to Wolof and Chiluba in Egypt. While colonizers boasted about teaching us etiquettes and finesse, they conveniently overlooked the contributions of Ziryab, a black man from Iraq, who introduced Europe to refined dining during the Moorish era. They pride themselves on gifting us writing and sciences, but neglect to mention that these very foundations were laid down during interactions between ancient Egyptians and Phoenicians. The existence of indigenous African writing systems that have survived the test of time is seldom recognized. They claim to have introduced us to God, yet every prayer they utter ends with Amen, a word deeply rooted in African spirituality. Some Africans believe colonization had benefits, largely due to a lack of awareness or understanding of the vast scale of atrocities committed during that period. Kenya, 1952 to 1960. The British suppression of the Mau Mau freedom fighters resulted in an estimated 90,000 casualties. Namibia, 1904 to 1907. The German-initiated Herero and Nama genocide claimed around 100,000 lives. Cameroon, 1955 to 1971. French forces clamping down on Cameroonian nationalists led to between 60,000 and 120,000 deaths. Madagascar, 1947 to 1949. The crackdown on Malagasy nationalists by the French resulted in a death toll ranging from 89,000 to 200,000. Tanzania, 1905 to 1907. The Maji Maji rebellion against German colonial rule caused approximately 325,000 fatalities. Madagascar, 1894 to 1904. The French colonial conquest and subsequent rule led to nearly 500,000 deaths. DR Congo, 1890 to 1911. The brutal rule and exploitation by King Leopold II of Belgium in the Congo Free State are estimated to have caused a staggering 12 to 32 million deaths. These figures highlight the devastating impact of colonization on Africa and serve as a stark reminder of a traumatic chapter in the continent's history. If it was Africans who played a pivotal role in civilizing the world and impacted Europe significantly, and if Europe did not contribute to the civilizing process but rather decimated Africa during the slave trade, erasing its illustrious history, causing the loss of 73 million lives during colonization solely for its own enrichment. If colonization merely extended the horrors of slavery, encompassing exploitation, discrimination, and cultural erasure, and if the cutting-edge technologies we often associate solely with Europe might have had their roots in Africa, then what are the so-called benefits of colonization that some suggest? Plainly put, colonization brought about death, enslavement, impoverishment, and cultural obliteration on an unprecedented scale across the continent. Colonization stands as a monumental atrocity, on par with other heinous acts like the European and Arab slave trades. There was no silver lining to colonization. Any positive portrayal of colonization not only whitewashes grave crimes against humanity, but also disrespects and belittles the memories of our ancestors. If colonization is touted as a means of cultural exchange, then by that logic, one could argue that figures like Hitler were also merely sharing their culture. The core issue faced by Africans today is not that they are missing out on the supposed advantages of colonization. Rather, it's the aspiration to adopt Western affluence without the poverty associated with Western influence. The goal isn't to embrace our African roots but to emulate the lifestyles of the West, their languages, cultures, religions, materialistic views, and individualistic philosophies. Even the names that were given during times of subjugation are still in use. This adoption often stems from a lack of understanding about the true impacts of colonization. Challenging the remnants of colonization goes beyond confronting the economic and political structures in place. We must also reevaluate the languages we speak, the histories we've been taught, the religious practices, philosophical beliefs, and even the names we bear. Alongside the dismantling of the neocolonial economy and governance, these colonial impositions need to be shed. It's essential for Africa to recenter itself, to be truly African again. This shift towards embracing our roots and authentic identity is termed as Afrocentricity, and it's through this Afrocentric perspective that genuine liberation for Africa can be realized.